Welcome to the Practice Leader Podcast, brought to you by Ascent, a show for medical practice administrators who feel stuck in the daily chaos and want to lead with intention. I'm Zed Williamson, founder and CEO of Physician Growth Accelerator.
And I'm Paul Richards, president of Ascent and director of otolaryngology at the University of Utah School of Medicine. Every week, we explore what high-performing leaders are doing in real time, so you can stop reacting and start leading with purpose, strategy, and results.
Only the leader in the organization has anything to do with guiding culture, right? Actually, that's not the case at all. That's why we're speaking with our guest today, Natalie Johnson. She specializes in optimizing organizational performance by increasing energy, fostering team connections, and developing courageous leaders. Natalie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So when people sometimes hear the word culture, it's this word that gets tossed around a lot. Sometimes people think it means buy a ping pong table and have more birthday cakes. Sometimes they think it means something else, but you're really passionate about the idea that it's not just one person that drives this. It has to do with every human in the organization.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right. Culture is this word that people kind of know what it is, but find it difficult to explain. And it's this underlying invisible thing that impacts everyone. But I like to define culture as it's the way that we are relating to each other. It's all about relationships.
And so if we're thinking about a workplace and a medical practice workplace, I'm going to throw out some scenarios that some of the listeners right now are probably going to smile about because I'm speaking some truth that they're witnessing. And it might be that they're frustrated with employees who maybe don't take initiative, or they're frustrated with employees who show up late, or it just doesn't seem like they're proactive, or maybe there's some defensiveness or negativity, or maybe some gossip. So if culture is how we all connect, what does someone do? How does a practice administrator tackle this thing that feels so big and feels almost like it's untouchable?
It's such a good question. And what you just described is so common in most workplaces because the default in workplaces is that we as human beings naturally default to friction, confusion, and underperformance. And so the biggest thing that stands in our way in being able to relate to each other better and to connect with each other is our human biology. When we feel busy, overwhelmed, things are changing, or maybe like what you just said is that we have a person that's not performing up to expectation, we tend to get into a reactive mode. And that's the stress response kicking in. And when we're in a reactive mode, it means I feel annoyed with this person in my practice, so I act annoyed. So maybe I'm a little closed with them. Maybe I make assumptions about what's happening with them. And what happens in most practices and workplaces in general is you have a lot of people performing, doing their job, and doing it reactively. So I'm getting some stuff done, but I feel annoyed, so I act annoyed. So I don't take the time to ask and be curious about why someone isn't taking the initiative. I don't naturally take the time to be generous in my interpretation of them and think, well, maybe there's something else going on in their life that I don't know about. And so a lot of the work, I would say almost all of it, is common sense. We all know the things that we could potentially do to connect to other people, but it is not common practice because we have this barrier of reactivity and stress and high demand that stands in our way. And so if a practice administrator was looking to do something different, the first thing I would tell them is that they have an opportunity to have a huge impact on that relationship. And one of the best things that they can do is pause and think about how they could be more generous in their interpretation of the other person and lead a conversation with them, starting with curiosity instead of assumptions, instead of what they think is happening. And that would be a really great place to start.
Paul, I don't know if this has ever happened to you, so I'm not going to only put you on the spot. I'll put myself on the spot. I know a
Yeah.
mistake that I've made is I've been frustrated with an employee about an assumption that was silent on my part. So how silly is that, right? I have a silent expectation
Yes.
And then
Yes.
I get frustrated when they don't meet it. I don't know if you've ever caught yourself doing that, Paul. You probably you probably better not. So
It sounds like Natalie's got an experience, but yeah, no, go ahead, Natalie. I think you might have one there.
Well, I think what comes to mind for me first is not the workplace, but my home place, my home. I definitely can think of lots of examples with my two sons. I have a son in college, I have a son in high school, around I have this expectation of them that they should have done something, but I didn't really communicate it very clearly. And so now that leaves me disappointed. Maybe I'm irritable, maybe I'm shaming and blaming, but that example in particular, I think what comes up for me is things that I can do at home with my family. Is there's these silent expectations because that's what I did when I was their age, or that's what you're supposed to do, but we never really had a conversation about it. Um, yeah, and that again creates that disconnection and certainly isn't supporting the relationship.
So how my thought on all this is it, you have like policies sometimes in your office, you have
Mhm.
procedures, and you have these like guiding mission statements and vision statements, right? And that's to hopefully create those expectations, but not everything can have a policy, a procedure. Some of it's just I don't know. And so one of the struggles we have, or I've had, or I've seen is I can't write everything out.
Right.
But and to do that, I would be spending so much time with like bureaucracy and then get that policy vetted. And because we live in a culture, I'm in academic medicine, we'll take a policy and we'll vet it to an executive committee, then it goes to our full faculty to review, and 3 months later we maybe have a
Yeah.
policy, and it's just part how do we just get good culture, without having to regulate and be big brother, and that's been our struggle.
Absolutely. And not everything necessarily needs a policy or an operations manual or a procedure because a lot of what develops culture and relationships again is common sense. And I think what I'm hearing you talk about, Paul, is really what the group norms are.
Yeah.
And so group norms make up what the culture is. And so that's what's okay and what's not okay in our culture.
Yeah.
And group norms are developed either intentionally because we've said, this is how we work. This is so, for example, this is how we as a team respond to mistakes.
Hmm.
Perhaps we listen, we pause, we identify the problem, and then we move pretty quickly to what have we learned and how can we do better. So that's an example of a group norm that has been shared in the group, and that is what we do. Now, if a group norm has not been shared, it can turn into what I call is accidental culture. So we've never had a conversation about what the group norm is around making mistakes. And so what happens now is someone makes a mistake and the reaction to it is, I can't believe they made the mistake. And it's the pointing the finger and whose fault is it? And there's shame and there's blame. So that's also a group norm, but we haven't had any conversation about it. It just developed accidentally. And so what people know in the culture now is, I don't share my mistakes.
Hmm.
Um, that's going to be held against me. And that doesn't feel safe. And so I would say those policies, those procedures that don't need to be created around how we do things are intentional group norms. And that requires that someone, ideally a leader, because a leader is going to have the most impact, but ideally someone states, this is what's okay and this is what's not okay on our team. We're all going to make mistakes. And when we do, this is how we handle them. This is how we process them. This is how we learn from them. And leaders' job is to demonstrate practicing the behaviors that are okay to create the group norm. So it would be really helpful for leaders to demonstrate by sharing when they have made a mistake. It would also be really helpful for leaders to reward others when they do the same. So it's not a reward for the mistake, it's a reward for thank you for sharing that you made the mistake. That is our stepping stone to learning and growth. And then it's also helpful when the leader can discourage people from a group norm that is not welcomed. Um, and so I feel like I gave you a long answer there, but what I heard in your question was, oh, those are the group norms. It's not policies and procedures, it's
Hmm.
statements and conversations to establish what's okay and what's not okay on our team.
Yeah, I like that. How about advice for, let's say there's an individual when you get in bigger in bigger groups, there's a lot more different types of personalities. Sometimes there's people that just aren't as self-aware of the norms, and you what's innate to like one, it's like, oh yeah, this is not the right behavior. These are the right expectations. That they just don't get it. They always think they're the exception or they're a victim of some, whatever. How do you deal with that?
And so it depends on the person and what role they are in. And so if you have a person on your team and they don't have a lot of self-awareness and they're kind of taking over the conversation,
Mhm.
um, and they're not listening to other people or they're not asking for other people's opinions, that's another example where we can set a group norm around. Our group norm in meetings is we need to hear from everyone. So we have a process in place to do that. And when we have a person that's sharing too much, this is what we do. We pause and we ask them if we can pause for a minute and get some input from some other people, and then we can continue on if we feel as the group it's necessary. Sometimes that requires a private conversation with that person. That the group norm we want to establish is we want to hear from everyone, and so how can you contribute to and help us hear from everyone, including yourself? So sometimes that can be a private conversation, sometimes that can be a group norm.
Mhm.
It's really important for leaders to be willing to, again, to demonstrate that behavior. So having leaders who really intentionally ask for other people's opinions instead of sharing theirs all the time, or saying things like, I oversee this department, I oversee this practice, but I can't do it without you. I need your area of expertise, I need your impact, and asking for it, but not asking for it from one person, but equally from the group, and continuing to really push that narrative that we're all in this together and I need to hear from all of you. A lot of culture requires that people get a little uncomfortable in that discomfort of not being the one to speak up all the time, in that discomfort of saying, I don't have all the answers or I don't know what the best response is to that. Let's hear from someone else on the team.
I love that. And there's one thing around it sounds like a lot of the things that we're talking around can relate to assumed intent. And one of the
Hmm.
group norms that we've
Yes.
really put into place here is that you don't assume negative intent. And it's amazing the lens that that can put on a scenario because, whether it's somebody, we go back to sons. I have a son in college and in high school. So it's like, how did you walk past the garbage that was overflowing? And our brain goes negative intent. They saw it. They're just lazy. They
Yes.
don't want to do it. Right. As
Yes.
opposed to what's the positive intent. And it sounds like a lot of what we're talking about really could fall into that. Or is the team assuming positive intent or is the team assuming negative intent?
Hmm. Yep, absolutely right. And we sometimes call this being skilled at skillful storytelling. So, what is the story you're telling yourself about why that person did or didn't do something? And is that story helping create more connection with them? Or is that story actually help making us disconnect from the person? And so, having definitely positive intent, but again, being generous in our interpretation and being willing to say and admit that we don't know everything about anyone. We can never take the lens and experience of someone else and put it on ourselves. And so pausing for a moment to recognize in every situation, your son, your spouse, your boss, your colleague, the patient, in every situation, there's a lot that that person has experienced that has contributed to the way that they show up. And so when we're able to admit there's a lot we don't know, we can approach situations like that. Even in your example of you walked right by the trash can, we can approach it with curiosity. And instead of just assuming you walked right by, you could have thrown it in there just being lazy, it might be a question of, I saw you had some trash there. And I noticed you walked by the trash can. So just wanted to check in with you. That's a different feeling and a different approach.
So when you know, the practices that are out there, sometimes this feels big
Hmm.
and administrators are focused on the now. And sometimes I've found that our brain will call something important, but not apply the level of importance to it for me to really take action on it. So how does someone start, with in that case where they know that it's not the greatest scenario in the world, but it just feels too big.
And are you talking about culture in general?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Just
one of the
imagine the
things.
accidental culture that you mentioned, I
Yeah.
think that's how you referred to it, a
Mhm.
practice that is completely that. They've hired people, they've never paid attention to norms, purposely when hiring people. They don't talk about group norms within the organization. They're constantly frustrated, but they feel like they're playing whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
And the idea, this feels really slow to them to try to do something around culture.
Absolutely. I've experienced that culture can feel really big and like something that is just unattainable when people think about culture as being this destination that they're trying to get
Mhm.
to. So we're trying to get to a thriving culture and it feels so far away. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. Culture is not a destination, it's a journey that you're always on. And so even when you're able to create really positive group norms, every team is facing change, high demand, turnover, and with all of that comes we now need to be intentional of the culture we want as change is coming our way. And so the best first step in changing the culture is being willing to lean into some of the practices yourself and share it with others, whether you're in a leadership role or not. And so that might require that a person be vulnerable and they have a conversation with their team or maybe even a colleague and just say, I love my work. It's feeling a little toxic. I would love to work in a place that we could actually navigate these system issues together. We can't control these system issues, but I'd like to work in a place where we can be in it together and navigate it together. And so I'm going to make a move in the right direction of beginning to establish some boundaries, or I'm going to make a move in the right direction. And then I'm going to begin to admit things like, I don't have the answer, or I'm completely overwhelmed today, because it's through those vulnerability that you begin to connect with other people that you're around, and that is contagious. And so you start to move the needle a little bit. And one thing that we haven't talked about is that organizational culture or bigger practice culture is made up of the culture of each individual team. And what we see typically is that there are some teams that have a pretty positive culture. It can be mediocre to positive, but it's pretty good. And then you have other teams that are just toxic. And so it's it's the accumulate of all of those that make up the organization culture. And so it really is a little bit whack-a-mole in that each team needs to be on that journey of being intentional around their culture, especially as they face change and high demands and turnover. And where many teams go wrong is they get into that mode of such high demand and busyness is that they're just going from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. They're not pausing to appreciate other people or the work that they've done. They're not pausing to connect with each other. They can still get stuff done, but it becomes toxic because everybody on the team becomes disconnected from each other. And that's where the story starts. That's where the negative intentions um, start to surface, where we make negative assumptions about other people and their behavior. And so it's really about looking at culture as it's a journey that we're always on. And it's especially important to be intentional when we're in high demand and when we're stressed. And it's not a big, unattainable goal. It's individual people choosing to work a little bit differently and more connected to each other.
Do you ever run into where the practice administrator feels that this is what we have to do? It's time for us to focus on this, and the biggest barrier is a physician.
Because the physician isn't on board.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and,
And
maybe the physician is, let's say, in private practice, maybe they're an owner, or maybe they're just, physicians in general within practices are seen as part of quote unquote leadership, whether they are leadership or not, just because of the
right.
the level of who they are. Do you ever see that? And do you have any guidance for that administrator who's dealing with a scenario like that?
Well, I think on one side, it's really important for the administrator to paint a really clear picture of why you're trying to move in a specific direction, or why there is a system change or a direction move. And so painting a really clear picture of what the vision is. This is what the vision is that I have for this movement in this direction, for this system issue. And here is where you fit, the physician fit really nicely into this vision. Here's your strengths. Here's where you've really contributed well. Here's where I see you fitting in well to this vision. And now I want to hear from you. What are some of the barriers that you see? What am I not seeing? So having that really open conversation around, you are part of the vision. And this is where I see you fitting in really nicely for us collectively to reach this goal or the direction that we're headed. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're always going to be on board, but a lot of resistance comes from lack of transparency around the bigger vision and why we're moving in this direction. So really being transparent around that direction that you want to move with the practice, and being really specific around how this professional is so valuable and can contribute to that. And then recognizing as an administrator what your sphere of influence is. So we all have a sphere of influence. We have the things that we can absolutely control, which is the way that I behave, the way I think, the things that I say and don't say. We also have people that we can influence. And so perhaps it's the physician, the teams, my colleagues, my behaviors influence them. And then we have the things that we have zero influence at all. And what happens when we make big change is, and in this scenario, the physician is likely focusing on this, but other people are as well, is we start really digging into and thinking about all the things that we have zero control over. And we waste time and energy on all the things we can't control, and it's exhausting. And so getting the physician as well as other people to shift just a little bit to what I can control and what I can influence, because it's in that space where we're now navigating this issue together, instead of me as the administrator saying, we're moving in this direction and you're coming along, or we're moving in this direction, and although you don't like it, you're coming anyway. And so it's paying attention to being really clear about the vision, where that physician fits, but also shifting to a place with the team and the physician where we're really investing in the things we can control and influence, and not what we have no control over.
I love that. I think, listeners should rewind and listen to that a couple times, because the way, if you can speak a vision to someone, now you're not battling over what's in front of you. You're discussing, here's where we're going, and now everybody can participate. That's great. Really good.
Well,
Really good advice.
Okay, good. I'm glad you like it. And maybe the only other thing I would add is that one of the number one triggers of people resisting or people being defensive at work over any situation is a fear of irrelevance. And so recognizing that there might be some fear behind this physician or behind the person, and that they're fearful their skills are not going to be as relevant if we move in this direction. So when you can recognize that underneath there might be a fear of irrelevance there, some of their behaviors can make more sense, and it's easier to have the conversation.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Natalie, you're speaking twice at the upcoming Ascent conference in Kansas City, September 9th to 12th. If those of you out there have not registered, definitely register. It's going to be a great event. And you have two talks, and I want to give the titles so people can put them on their agenda to make sure they catch you. One of them is Accidental to Intentional, Optimize Culture from the Inside Out. And the other one is Mastering Mental Focus, Training for Today's Healthcare Attention Economy. I really appreciate you taking the time and spending it with us and our listeners today. And if you want to connect with Natalie, we have put her LinkedIn link in the show notes, and you can also find her, Natalie Johnson, at Vital Work. Thanks for listening to the Practice Leader Podcast. If you're feeling the weight of challenges in your practice, know this: the problems you're struggling with today don't have to remain problems. There is a path forward, and you're not walking it alone.
Each week, we'll be here with insights, ideas, and real-world conversations to help you move forward from chaos to clarity.
See you next week.